You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
All you need is a few minutes to start your day off with something historic when you listen to the This Day in History podcast. Every day there's a new episode for you to listen and learn about what happened that day way back when. So listen and subscribe to This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts. That's This Day in History wherever you get your podcasts.
My name is Greg Jackson. I'm a PhD-holding historian, a professor, and the creator of History That Doesn't Suck, a podcast that makes legit, seriously researched American history come to life through entertaining stories. Join me for a chronological telling of the United States story, from the Revolution to fractious Civil War, tenacious inventors, brave reformers, and more. With more than 100 episodes, you can already binge listen your way from 1776 to the early 20th century. Listen to History That Doesn't Suck on Spotify.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 179, The Fall of France. Can we fight somewhere else? This week, a big thank you goes out to Matt with 1 T, Deadballing, and Matt with 2 T's for choosing to support the podcast by becoming members. You can find out more over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. A core goal of the British and French leaders during the months of the Phony War was to investigate the possibility of building up a coalition against Germany in Eastern Europe, or at the very least, trying to find a way to spread the war away from France, to create a situation in which Germany would commit its military resources to something, anything, other than an attack into France in the spring of 1940. Almost all of these discussions, with one very important outlier, would not lead to any real developments in 1940. In Eastern Europe, the nations almost universally decided to stay out of the war in early 1940, a decision that, for many of them, was completely logical. War would eventually come to the Balkans, but instead of a war spreading due to the creation of some kind of anti-German alliance, it was instead a result of some nations joining the German cause and then helping the Germans and Italians in their goals of conquest. But a lot of those situations and those scenarios were in the future, and a lot of these smaller nations just wanted to stay out of the war. In Northern Europe, another possible area of conflict, the two Western nations would build up some plans, and then they would not go so well, as we discussed during the episodes on the Norwegian campaign. The final area that the British and French considered expanding the war into was the Soviet Union, by bombing the Soviet Union, even though that meant bringing them into the war on the side of Germany. This obviously did not happen, but it is certainly a pretty big what-if scenario that would have drastically changed the course of not just the war, but probably the history that followed. After we discuss some of these plans for spreading the war away from France, we'll spend the last half of this episode covering some of the preparations that were being made by the Western Allies for the war during this very same period. Because one of the major reasons that they were never able to create a second front is because they did not have the resources to actually commit to a real campaign outside of France. There were very good reasons for these lack of resources, and they would only start to address them before the German invasion. Also, there would be a leadership change in Paris in March 1940, primarily due to the handling of the war up to that point, so we'll have to touch on that as well. But first we start with the desire of the British and French leaders to find another theater of operations, which in some ways saw its roots in the concerns among the leaders of both nations that the policy that they were pursuing for a long war was perhaps not working out as well as they expected. This feeling was felt very acutely by French leaders, and they were concerned that Germany was only going to get stronger, which meant that the longer they waited to start fighting, the worse off they would be. The result of this growing doubt was a series of investigations and conversations concerning a military operation somewhere on the map of Europe. These conversations would be important for the overall course of the war, not because the operations would happen, almost none of them would, but instead because it shows us where the Allied leaders were putting their focus during this period. This idea of finding another theater to operate in would be continued throughout most of the war for the Western Allies, and the same types of arguments that were used in London and Paris in late 1939 and early 1940 would be the same type of conversations that would lead to the invasion of North Africa or Italy after the American entry into the conflict. The most discussed theater of operations in 1939 was the Balkans and Eastern Europe, sort of more generally. During the first months of the war, there were constant conversations among the Supreme War Council and other committees about what was happening in the Balkans, the viewpoints of the nations in that region, and the possibility of bringing some or all of them into a war against Germany. One of the primary advocates for a Balkan attack was General Weygand, who would take command of all French forces in France after the invasion, but at the start of the war, he was the commander of all French forces in the eastern Mediterranean. Weygand's theory was that if the Allies put together a strong armored and mobile force, it did not have to be large, but instead focused on the types of equipment that the Allies had that the Balkan countries were short of. Then they could convince the Balkan countries with this force to join in an attack of upwards of 100 divisions, mostly infantry divisions, which the Allies would sort of bulk up with these specialist troops. There are probably a whole episode's worth of problems with this plan, but just to name maybe the two most important. Weygand did not have a plan for actually getting that kind of force into the eastern Mediterranean without alerting the Germans, and he did not have a plan to get the Balkan countries to actually work together with the Allies. If he wanted to reach 100 divisions, he would need them all working together, and that was basically never going to happen. Chamberlain and the British were also very concerned that any aggressive move in the region would just bring Italy into the war on the side of Germany, with Italy maintaining its neutrality in the conflict until June 1940. And so in early 1940, the British and the Royal Navy were really focused on trying to keep Italy out of it, because that allowed them to still use the Mediterranean in ways that really helped the Allied war effort. Another area that was discussed at the same time as the Balkans was an operation in Scandinavia, particularly targeting the iron ore trade that was in place between Sweden and Germany. We will not spend too much time on this idea, but it is important enough to the overall Allied plans during the Phoney War that we mention this again and kind of give an overview. The basic idea was that the British and French would use the Soviet attack into Finland during the Winter War as an excuse to move troops into the region, with the goal of gaining Norwegian support for the troops to be dropped off at Narvik and then moved to Finland from there. Even if Norway did not allow this to happen, then the Allies were still willing to continue the operation, even if it meant the violation of Norwegian neutrality. This operation was once again supported and criticized by different groups within each government. On the French side, General Gamelin, the commander of French forces in France, used his considerable influence to slow the overall preparations for any operation in Northern Europe. Some of this was based on his concerns that such an operation would not be successful, but also there was some level of greed happening because it would be from Gamelin's command that the troops for such an operation would have to be drawn, reducing his forces, reducing his power, and in his view, reducing his ability to withstand a possible German attack. The operation had more support in Britain, with both Churchill in his role of First Lord of the Admiralty and the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Ironside, both supporting the operation in early 1940. This quote from Ironside in December 1939, when discussing the possibility of an attack in Scandinavia, is perhaps one of the best possible criticisms of the overall lack of Allied action during the Phoney War. He would say, quote, "Time is of no use to us if we are not making use of it. I'm sure the Germans are making full use of it, and we appear to be buoying ourselves with false hopes of the war coming to an end." End quote. The preparations that were underway for the Norwegian expedition would be discovered by the Germans, and just as the British and French were finally ready to put their plans into place, the German invasion would begin. The delay in the operation and then the course of operations in Norway are perhaps the best example of why it's hard to see how any of these other theaters ever could have been a viable area of operations for the Allies. They simply were unwilling or unable to commit their resources to make it happen. In early 1940, the Allies just did not have the resources necessary to both defend against a possible German attack in France and operate somewhere else in Europe. And because of that, all of their plans for possibly opening a second front were largely theoretical because it would have just required more resources than they were willing to commit. And speaking of things that would have required more resources than the Allies were willing to commit, they also discussed openly attacking the Soviet Union. These sets of conversations were quite interesting, particularly as things would develop throughout the course of the Second World War. There were very real discussions that would occur between British and French leaders about launching a strategic bombing campaign of the Soviet Union in 1940. In retrospect, the idea that the Western Allies would willingly start a war with the Soviet Union seems borderline absurd. They were struggling to find a way to deal with the military power of Germany, and then they were going to add that of the Soviet Union? But they did at least have a few different reasons, even if some of them were based on incorrect information. The first reason that a war with the Soviet Union was considered was around the idea that France and Britain were trying to protect neutral nations from the aggressions of Germany. This had been a major point for why the two nations claimed to provide their guarantee to Poland to protect him from German aggression. But of course, the Soviet Union had also invaded Poland, and had also started a war with Finland. In October 1939, a report would be written by the Chiefs of Staff Committee, an advisory body made up of the Chiefs of Staff of the various British military arms. In this report, they would discuss whether or not the British should more directly intervene in Finland, which would almost certainly have led to an open war between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. A major topic of conversation in the report was the views of other neutral nations towards the British and French, with this quote being a pretty good representation as to why. Quote, "At present, the sincerity of France and Great Britain is being questioned, and force is being added to German propaganda, particularly in Italy and Spain, because we have not declared war on Russia, in spite of the fact that she has already interfered with the liberty of small states in much the same way as Germany. There is therefore danger, some danger, that if we fail to stand up to Russia, we may lose the sympathy of neutral states to an extent which may have dangerous military implications." End quote. The report would end with the firm recommendation not to take action, though, due to concerns that from a military perspective, there were simply not the resources available that would be required if they were to add another nation to their list of enemies. For the duration of the Winter War, the idea of attacking the Soviet Union to aid Finland would continue, although support for the idea would kind of ebb and flow based on events. In most cases, there was more support for such an action among the political bodies of both nations, with Gamelin claiming in January 1940 that the French Parliament was demanding action against the Soviets. But that did not mean that there were not military supporters of these operations as well, with General Weygand being, again, firmly on the side of an attack, although this was again partially due to the fact that it would be his command that would have to grow to accommodate the new objectives. Weygand would say in a letter to Gamelin that, quote, "I believe it is of utmost importance to break the back of the USSR in Finland and elsewhere," end quote. It might be good, at this point, to re-emphasize that there were sizable groups in both Britain and France that still considered communism to be the real enemy that they should be fighting against. Not Germany, not the Nazis, not fascism. Communism was the enemy. And so there was always some level of support for operations against the Soviet Union. The problem with any scheme to try and aid Finland goes back to the challenges of any action against Germany away from France, a lack of resources. Launching any kind of land campaign required the men and materiel that were so urgently needed in France. They may also be wondering why they believe that any of this would help in the war against Germany, other than among the public opinion of small neutral nations. And that brings us to the final reason that war with the Soviet Union came close to happening: oil. The long war idea that the British and French had entered into the war pursuing was based on the premise that the German economy was balanced on a knife's edge. German rearmament had been pushing too fast and too hard, and the German economy was on the verge of collapse, or at least that was the hope in London and Paris. But then the war started, and that economic collapse did not appear to be imminent. And in fact, the German economy was performing even better than it had before the start of the war. This prompted attempts to try and find a reason why, with Swedish iron ore being one possible cause, which would result in the entire Norwegian adventure. Another major contributing factor that was identified was Russian oil. After their collaboration in the dismantling of Poland, Germany and Russia had signed an economic agreement that would see Russian raw materials, including oil, shipped to Germany in return for finished products and machine tools. This resulted in a plan in which the British and French would try and reduce the amount of oil making its way to Germany through a major bombing operation that would be discussed and which would target the Russian oil industry around Baku in modern-day Azerbaijan. This operation would very quickly gain high-level support from both French political and military leaders. On the British side, there was also strong support among some key leaders and even from the RAF, whose planes would be needed to execute the mission. During the first 2 months of 1940, plans very rapidly came together, with the basic idea being that 12 squadrons of bombers would be transferred to the Middle East, and would operate primarily out of French airfields in Syria. They would then embark on a 2 to 3 month bombing campaign against the oil production facilities around Baku, with the belief that this could reduce the oil production of the region by up to 50%. One of the things I find very interesting about this idea is the fundamental misunderstanding of the leaders of Britain and France around the fragility of the German economy. The oil flow from the Caucasus was important, but removing it would not have caused the German collapse or collapse of the Soviet Union, as some of the most optimistic reports at this time seem to indicate. This mistake was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of the resiliencies of economies in the 1940s, a resiliency that would be put on display many times over in the years that followed, as nations were able to rapidly recover from invasions and strategic bombing campaigns that would have been considered fatal by the planners in 1940. There was also, of course, just an extreme optimism about the capabilities of the British and French bombers against the oil production facilities around Baku. Assuming they were able to actually find the target, which was in no way a guarantee in 1940, the amount of bombs that 12 squadrons of medium bombers could drop, even if they made a maximum effort for 3 months, probably would have barely put a dent in the production of oil in the region. Due to the distributed nature of oil production and the large footprint of even relatively concentrated facilities like refineries, they would prove to be very difficult to actually destroy through strategic bombing campaigns. For example, there were late war efforts to destroy synthetic oil production in Germany and the refinement of oil in various areas around Europe, including in Romania, maybe the most importantly. These were bombing raids with hundreds of late war heavy bombers, your B-17s, B-24s, Halifaxes, Lancasters. One of my favorite statistics is that just the bomb load of a Lancaster was larger than the maximum takeoff weight of some of the British and French medium bombers in 1940. The idea that 12 squadrons of medium bombers in 1940, who, again, would have problems just finding the target, could put the oil production facilities of Baku out of action in any serious way was grossly overestimating the strength of that bombing. But it would not be the feasibility of serious damage that would cause the raids to not occur, and it would instead just be, general concern for, starting a war with the Soviet Union. This nagging problem would continue to slow preparations throughout early 1940, even though preparations were being made in Syria to receive the bombers. There would be a burst of action when Renault replaced Daladier as French Prime Minister in March 1940, an event that will be discussed in just a moment. But the preparations would take time, and the timeline that Weygand communicated to Paris is that they would not be ready in Syria to begin receiving bombers until the end of May and early June. This meant that obviously the bombing campaign couldn't start until then, and so they never really got to the point where there was a firm yes or no on whether this was happening because the German invasion intervened. In retrospect, though, the entire concept of willingly attacking the Soviet Union is just absurd, given the incredible military power that would be on display on the Eastern Front after the German invasion in 1941. And so the British and French were probably lucky that they were saved from the possibility of making such a mistake by the German invasion, because adding the Soviet Union to their list of enemies probably would have resulted in even more military disasters in 1940 and the years that followed, and they were already going to have enough. Today's podcast is proudly sponsored by Fold 3, the web's premier collection of military records that helps bring the events of World War II history to life. Immerse yourself in over 670 million records as you explore photographs, individual service records, formerly classified military documents, and more. Learn how the greatest generation's triumphs and sacrifices impacted history as you take a front row seat to epic tales of courage, sacrifice, resilience, and valor. Have a veteran in your family? On Fold 3, you can combine records found on the site with what you have in your own albums and shoeboxes to create an online memorial for someone who served. Discover your military ancestors today at fold3.com.
Hello, this is Matt from the Explorers Podcast. I want to invite you to join me on the voyages and journeys of the most famous explorers in the history of the world. At the Explorers Podcast, we plunge into jungles and deserts, across mighty oceans and frigid ice caps, over and to the top of great mountains, and even into outer space. These are the thrilling and captivating stories of Magellan, Shackleton, Lewis and Clark, and so many other famous and not so famous adventurers from throughout history. So come give us a listen. We'd love to have you. Go to explorerspodcast.com or just look us up on your podcast app. That's the Explorers Podcast.
While France and Britain would not end up attacking the Soviet Union, the effects of their lack of action would be felt in France during March 1941. Prime Minister Daladier had led the French government into war, but from the very earliest moments of the conflict, his position had not been strong. He had attempted to form a coalition government, much like what the French government in 1914 had done at the start of that war, because he wanted to ensure full support for the government across the entire range of political opinion in France. But this effort failed, with the leaders on the right and the left of French politics being simply unwilling to work together. On the left, the socialists insisted that Léon Blum be their representative in any coalition, but on the right, the conservative leader, Louis Morin, refused to join any government with Blum in it. There was also some resistance from the French right because they were fighting Germany and they thought they shouldn't be fighting Germany, that they should be fighting the Soviet Union. With this effort to form a coalition a failure, Daladier would continue on leading the government until March 1940. The end of the Winter War, with Finland forced to sign very harsh terms with the Soviet Union, would bring renewed pressure on Daladier due to the desire for many leading French politicians for action against the Soviet Union. On the 14th, in the French Senate, Daladier would be heavily criticized for the lack of French action in the Winter War, with the belief that France should have done something to come to Finland's aid. Daladier would attempt to defend his position, stating that it was the British who were to blame, as they had resisted any unified action, or at least delayed such actions long enough for them not to be useful. These debates would then split out into the Chamber of Deputies in the days that followed, with the two French politicians, Pierre Laval in the Senate and Pierre-Étienne Flandin in the Chamber, leading the charge. It's worth mentioning that in the case of both of these politicians, they had never really supported France's war against Germany and had opposed the declaration of war in September 1939. This is because they were both of the belief that France should not be fighting Germany, they should instead be focused on fighting the Soviet Union. Daladier would lose a vote of confidence in the Chamber of Deputies and then would refuse to attempt to form a new government. The French president would then ask Paul Reynaud to take on the position of prime minister. Now, Reynaud was known for his strong and persistent advocacy for greater investment in the French military in the years before the war. His first move, once he became prime minister, was to try and form a government of national union, again, a coalition government, but he would succumb to the pressure from the right and would not invite Léon Blum, which meant support from the socialists was a bit shaky. This meant that the support for the government was slim, and in fact, on the first day of the new government, there would again be a vote of confidence that Reynaud would win by just a single vote, and there were a lot of abstentions. And through all of this, the government that Reynaud was forced to create exhibited the quintessential trait of Third Republic governments. It had the predecessor as prime minister on the cabinet, and a lot of the ministers were very similar. Daladier, even though he was no longer prime minister, still enjoyed strong support among the powerful group of political leaders. Reynaud needed those leaders to support his government, or he wouldn't have a government. And the only way to do that was to bring Daladier into the government as Minister of National Defense. That's right, Daladier, whose government had fallen due to its handling of the war, would then be put into the position of Minister of National Defense while France was actively at war. This meant that many of his policies and decisions would continue, including his strong support for General Gamelin at the head of the French army. Reynaud wanted to remove Gamelin. He wanted really bad to remove Gamelin from his position, believing that he was simply unfit for the job. But Gamelin and Daladier were very close. They were, in some ways, a package deal. And it would only be when it was far too late for France that Reynaud would be able to change out Gamelin for another general. In London, the Chamberlain government was under similar pressure due to the conduct of the war up to that point. The tipping point would prove to be the handling of the campaign in Norway, with a spirited debate occurring in the Commons on May 7th. Duff Cooper, a strong critic of Chamberlain and having resigned from his position of First Lord of the Admiralty in protest after the Munich Agreement had been signed, would say, quote, "Again and again we have met in this house, sometimes summoned suddenly in an emergency, always to record a setback, a disaster, always to listen to the disappointment, the astonishment, and the surprise of the Prime Minister." End quote. On the 8th of May, the debate would eventually result in a vote of confidence in the Commons, which Chamberlain would win, but with far from unanimous support, with the final vote being 281 to 200. It would be the end of the Chamberlain government, although a replacement would not be found until May 10th. There were two possible successors, Lord Halifax and Winston Churchill, with both men appealing to slightly different groups within British politics. Churchill would eventually get the job, starting on May 10th, but only as the head of a broad coalition government. The War Cabinet, the five most powerful men in Britain, would have Churchill, two Labour leaders, Attlee and Greenwood, Halifax as Foreign Secretary, and Chamberlain. Much like Reynaud, Churchill could not ignore the strong support that Chamberlain maintained among a large group of British politicians. Churchill also largely kept Chamberlain's ministers in position sort of more broadly, with around 2/3 of ministers still in their same positions after the new government was in power. Now, I am kind of criticizing that a little bit. I think that it does mean that there was less change, perhaps, in the government than could have otherwise been. But in a time of war, stability is important, and this is a fact for both the British and the French governments. Some of that stability should be valued when it comes to leading a government, making sure that things run smoothly at a time of great national crisis. And at least in London, by the time that Churchill was in position, the German invasion had already begun, leading to a very hot and heavy first few weeks for the Prime Minister. On the 13th, as the German invasion was rolling through the Low Countries and through France, Churchill would be asked to deliver the first of what was several quite famous orations before Parliament, at one point saying, quote, "You ask, what is our policy? I will say it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all of our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be, for without victory there is no survival." End quote. Now, that's a very heroic speech, and it goes on a little bit longer. But it was May 13th, 1940, and the fact that Churchill was before Parliament giving a speech like that pointed to one thing: the war was not going well. And the plans that had been put in place by the British and French and before September 1939, after September 1939, they had not been going well. And in fact, after May 10th, they had failed. And so next episode, we'll discuss the details of those plans, what they were trying to achieve, what they were trying to prevent, and a little bit of why they failed so horribly when they were put to the test.